Thank you, everybody. And we've finished exactly on time, so that's splendid. Now we can get on to the much more interesting business of the evening, to introduce Eleanor Lickmanova, who is doing her PhD at Oxford and is a curator of medieval manuscripts at the British Library, and is going to be talking to us this evening about mendicants and margins, the storytelling context of the Rutland Psalter. Thank you very much, Eleanor.
Many thanks for the invitation and for the opportunity to present my research. This is a hugely thrilling opportunity, and I'm really, really pleased to be here. My talk today will be based on one of the chapters of my dissertation, and in order to give you some context, let me first introduce my research. It all started with this manuscript that is called the Rutland Psalter, and that is kept at the British Library. This manuscript I came across while doing some research for one of my MA essays, and to my great surprise, I discovered that there are not that many publications on this manuscript, despite its primary significance for the history of medieval English illumination. And this significance, it is significant for one very specific reason. Not only, and not quite, because it is a deluxe manuscript produced for patrons of the highest status. We think that patrons might be King Henry III and Queen Eleanor of Provence because of the royal figures that are depicted in the initial to Psalm 101, which is a traditional placement for the figures of patrons. It is also possible that this book at some point ended up in the hands of the de Lacy family, because we have an added obit of Edmund de Lacy slightly later in the 13th century. And Edmund de Lacy was very close to the royal family. So this manuscript points to the patrons of a royal circle. But this is not the reason why it's so remarkable. The main reason why it's so remarkable is because the Rutland Psalter contains the earliest extensive Western collection of images in the margins that to a modern eye look profane and maybe even sometimes slightly out of place in the margin of religious book. One example of such image would be this chess game, which will be a lot in focus today. This chess game is placed below Psalm 77, and there is no reference to any game, in particular chess game, in the text of this psalm. And so a reasonable and natural question would be, what does this game do in the margin of the Psalter? And because the Rutland Psalter is the earliest example of such extensive collection of images in the margins, this manuscript became an amazing opportunity to ask even a bigger question. Why do we see the appearance of these profane images in the margins of religious books, specifically in the mid-13th century, and specifically in England? What was the environment that generated such images? What was the function of these images in religious books? And these became primary questions of my doctoral dissertation that I'm still in the process of writing up. So this is very much work in progress, and I will be very interested to hear your feedback and have a discussion about what... So what I'm going to present is my current thinking on the subject, but it may change. Obviously, when I'm asking these questions, I'm joining an extremely vibrant discussion because historiography on Marginalia is truly enormous. And quite early in my thinking about Marginalia, I realized that it's impossible to find one answer to a subject that is as complex as marginal images. And one needs to dissect it into smaller questions. One needs to be a bit of a surgeon. And one of such questions would be, what is the significance of the margin as a space in a book? Is there any significance to the space? What were the reading practices that were surrounding devotional books that generated such images? A huge historiographic question is connection of marginalia to text, not only to the text on the pages of devotional books, but also to textual sources more generally. And then there is another big question, which is artistic creativity and novelty. Can we say that artists were the true authors of marginal images, or the commissioners? And then probably the biggest question of all is a question of religious context. What was the religious context that generated this striking combination of the religious, the profane, and the humorous that we see in the margins of religious books? And today I'm going to talk about primarily these two questions, and I will be developing an idea that existed in scholarship for a very long time, but I think its significance to our understanding of marginalia has been overlooked. And I'm talking about the connection between marginalia and religious storytelling in contemporary preaching. In order for us to start discussing this subject, we need to go back to the unusual game of chess that we just saw. It is unusual because, well, primarily because one of the players is portrayed half naked. He also holds a piece of thread in his hand, and both opponents are engaged in what looks like slightly heated conversation. And I should say that there are not that many images in manuscript illumination that we can find of similar sort. In fact, specifically for the chess game, I found in specifically manuscripts only this one, because we quite used to images that portray chess game as a noble pastime where all participants are fully dressed. And here we again, this is a book of ours produced at the turn of the 14th century. Here again we see one opponent being fully dressed and another is half naked. But in this case, this image is connected, is placed together with depiction of bleeding Christ, as though being equated in importance with this profound religious depiction. Also, we see that the hands of the opponents are on the chessboard, as though they are in the argument. So kind of the same set of iconographic details repeats. What does it all mean? And a clue that starts to untime this chess tangle comes from the Chartres Cathedral. Around 15 years before the Rutland Psalter was created, we see that an image that was very similar to the one in the Rutland Psalter was installed in the west side, north transept of Chartres Cathedral. But here, the chess game that looks so similar because one opponent is again fully dressed, another is half naked. Here, this chess game illustrates the story of the prodigal son from the Gospel of Luke. And Gospel of Luke tells this very famous narrative about a father whose youngest son asked for the full inheritance before father's death. And then the story goes like this. The youngest son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. And that's it. St. Luke doesn't provide any more details to the specific ways in which the prodigal son squandered his wealth and in specific ways of his wild living. And yet here in Chartres Cathedral, we see that the artist imagined this wild living of the prodigal son in a very specific way as a chess game. And of course the question is why? Because for us the chess game is a noble intellectual pastime. How could it be the wild living? Maybe you started guessing that the chess game that we are seeing here is not a standard chess game, but its gambling version. One of the opponents is portrayed half naked because he lost all of his possessions. One of the opponents in the Rutland Psalter also holds a piece of thread in his hand probably because to emphasize that he's threadbare and stripped to the bone. We also see that on both chess boards there is dice because the gambling chess was played with the help of dice. The combination of different attitudes to medieval attitudes to chess can elucidate to us this really strange, very curious connection between wasting one's life, gambling, prodigal son story, and the chess game. And first of all, we have Richard Fournival, who was a contemporary of the Rutland Psalter and a chancellor of Amiens. And in his Roman Svetula, he is praising the game of chess at length, but he says that this game is only noble if it's not played to amass money, which means that it was played to amass money. The connection with gambling was so strong that chess was forbidden to play for clergy, who could neither participate nor even observe this horrible, horrible game. And what's more, when we read Alexander Neckham, we see that he is fully dismissing the chess game as an absolute vain activity. He says that players are fully absorbed by the game, they experience strong fits of passion, they put too much value into the winning, and quite often the game degenerates into a brawl. And he even exclaims, how many thousands of souls were sent to hell due to this horrible game? Something that I never thought could be said about chess game. And Alexander Neckham's criticism was not unsupported, because we know from court proceedings uncovered by John Carter that indeed a lot of gambling chess ended up in a fight or even a death of one of the participants. So it is not surprising that the game that is depicted in the Rutland Psalter and here in the Book of Hours, we see that players are portrayed in a heated debate or an argument around the chess, because that's what was happening at the time. But at the same time, chess was associated with aristocratic and knightly pastime and was notoriously linked, as Elizabeth Lappin demonstrated, to gambling during the Crusades. And gambling and chess were preventing knights from fulfilling their most sacred obligations. For instance, William of Tyre tells this episode about the siege of Edessa in his chronicle. And he talks about Raymond of Antioch and Jocelyn of Edessa, who were supposed to help John Comnene in a siege. But instead of doing that, instead of fighting, they had a lot of fun and gambled. But what is fascinating about the story is that 13th century depictions of William of Tyre's chronicle depict the gambling of Raymond of Antioch and Jocelyn of Edessa as a chess game. And so, in a way, chess game was the perfect way to tie the parable of the prodigal son to the ideas around going to a very distant country and squander your wealth in wild living to a chess game, because this is kind of association that a contemporary of the Rutland Psalter or a contemporary of the Chartres Cathedral would associate, would attach to the chess game. And another final link between the chess game and the Rutland Psalter and the prodigal son story is attested by an associative connection of this image to the text of the psalm on the page. Because this psalm specifically discusses a troubled relationship between generations of fathers and sons. And it says that God's grace fell upon previous generations of people of Israel. And this grace was passed on to the next generations of sons of Israel. But the sons, as the final line on the page says, tempted God in their hearts, just like the prodigal son who didn't follow the virtue steps of his father. And what we just discovered about this chess game and about this image in the margin of the Rutland Psalter tells, I think, a lot of interesting things about our understanding of marginal images. Because this image tells a story, and this story is associatively connected to the text on the page. But instead of straightforwardly continuing this message, it connects the content of the Psalter to realities contemporary and familiar to the audiences of this Psalter. And there is no contradiction between the contradiction that we might have perceived at the beginning when we saw this chess game between the religious and the profane. Both the text and the image work in unison. Both contain religious messages, but just messages of a different kind, because the text is prayer that references realities of the Old Testament, and the image is an emotional story that references realities that were familiar to contemporary audience of this Psalter. And this functions in a way like a hook, because chess game was a very cool pastime and probably an image that was pleasant to look at, but it was a trick to catch the audience and to make the moral message in this image more piercing and sharp. And this, I think, functions very similar. The religious storytelling that we see unraveling in the margin of the Rutland Psalter functions very similar to how religious storytelling functioned in preaching in the same period. And in order for us to see this connection more clearly, we need to go back in time. Specifically, we need to go back to the year 1215 to the Fourth Lateran Council. Canons 9 and 10 of the Fourth Lateran Council stated that bishops in their diocese, if they are unable to minister to their people themselves, must provide people who are capable to instruct the public by word and example. And this recommendation obviously encourages preaching in local communities, but it also shows that there was, by that point, not enough preaching in local communities. And we know that even in the 12th century, as later the 12th century, it were mostly bishops who would preach on a regular basis, whereas there was a significant lack of preachers in parish churches who were educated enough to preach on a regular basis for an extensive lay audience. But by the 13th century, this problem was successfully overcome, and preaching was understood as one of the main tools to combating heresies and to reaching out to parishioners' minds and forming their hearts. And major role here was played by mendicants who were specifically trained to preach, and whose leading purpose was to preach. And mendicants, in the first several decades of their work, established a network of schools that trained men in pastoral care and specifically preaching. And mendicants were travelers and always on the go, and they reached out to congregations even in very remote towns and villages. And Jacques de Vitry, who was a preacher himself, attested to the ubiquity of mendicants. He said, "They have so multiplied in such a short time that there is no Christian province where some of these brothers do not reside." And for popular preaching to be successful, it needs to be accessible, not excessively intellectual, and relevant to the audience's concerns. And the tool that satisfied all of these requirements were exemplar, meaning illustrative and entertaining stories with an instructive purpose. And it's not that entertaining stories didn't exist in religious context before the 13th century. They, of course, did, and we know stories of that sort existing from early Middle Ages. But as a separate, independent literary genre, exemplar was formed in Cistercian writings in the 12th century, and the 13th century saw the first true flourishing of exemplar. And it seems that by the 14th century, these exemplar became so prominent, they were included not only in preaching, but even in liturgical readings. From the 14th century, we have an exemplar collection that tells a story of a parishioner who wept while hearing a story of Guy of Warwick. And the same parishioner, the story goes, was left completely unmoved by the passion story in the Gospel. And Guy of Warwick is a prominent Romans hero, very popular in France and England between 13th and 15th centuries. And he falls in love with Lady Phyllis, a woman of a much higher standing. And then he, in order to win her heart, he travels and fights dragons and monsters and giants and wild animals. And finally, he wins her heart and repents afterwards his violent behavior and becomes a hermit. And this story was more interesting and touched the audience of this preacher who told this story more than the biblical account, because this tapped into the audience's sensibilities much more prominently. And the taste for such stories was used by preachers initially to make these stories, make their preaching more understandable for their audiences, and just simply make their audience listen to them. And then we see that by the early 14th century, such stories became so popular and so ubiquitous that they even started to be included in the readings during the Holy Week. And so I argue that one of the consequences is that new prevalence of storytelling in religious culture was the shift in private devotion, of which the Rutland Psalter is the first elaborate witness. This shift implies that storytelling became part of private devotion. Mary Carruthers suggests that such images, such marginal images, were memory cues that help readers to remember the text of the Psalms better. And I suggest that it's only part of their role, and their main aim was to remind audiences of their experiences outside of the Psalter reading, to remind them of stories they heard elsewhere, and particularly in churches. And solitary readers could ponder on these stories in a session of meditative prayer, and communal readers would discuss these stories and in a session of communal reading. And we know from the relatively large size of the Rutland Psalter that this was a book probably used, probably commissioned for communal reading rather than private reading. And we know also that in the 13th century, reading was still often a communal and oral exercise. And I think that Marginalia attests to additional narratives, such as Guy Horwick's story or the prodigal son story that we saw at the beginning, being retold during the session of prayer. And that will function very similar to how exemplars function in sermons, in the sense that, on the one hand, they would interrupt the monotony, because the reading of the Psalms would lack narration, and the Psalms themselves are quite repetitive. But on the other hand, they would allow readers to connect more emotionally to the contents of these books, because these stories would feature all recognizable elements of their contemporary culture. If we leaf through the pages of the Rutland Psalter and we look through different margins that we see there, we may be struck by their variety and the fact that they point in all kinds of different directions, and the variety and diversity of their literary, textual, visual sources is quite overwhelming. And even just in these 4 images, we see that, for instance, this image of a stag with a snake points to a bestiary illustration. It's almost a direct copy from a bestiary. Another image seems to point to a romance of Alexander and depicts the flight of Alexander the Great. We see an image that seemingly refers to a scene of everyday life, and then there are some other images that seem like products of pure imagination. And I think that it is in this variety that lies the key to seeing this connection between Marginalia and preaching, because it is exactly in this variety of stories that preachers would encourage their audiences to connect to religious messages that they portray. And I think one of the important ways to look at Marginalia in the Rutland Psalter is to try to understand them as a series, as a collection. And if we look at the thematical structure of Marginalia in the Rutland Psalter and compare it to the thematical structure of various exemplar collections that we have from the second half of the 13th century and early 14th century, we will see that the thematical structure and the subjects that are used both in the margins and in exemplar collections are remarkably similar. Here I'm giving you just one of the examples of one of the collections, that is anonymous English collection from the second half of the 13th century. And you see that all correspondences are highlighted in lighter color. I looked at several dozens of exemplar collections produced between mid-13th century to late 14th century, and all of them seem to have in common the same thing, this principle of combining scenes of everyday life with stories from mythology, history, Bible, and scenes that involve animals and different fables. And the same combination of stories is very prominent in margins of the Rutland Psalter. There is also a remarkable number of specific correlations, specific textual correlations with exemplar. I'm not going to go into much detail here because there are so many images that can be traced to exemplar collections, but I just want to give you a flavor of that, and I will show you 3 groups of images. This first group similarly refers to different literary genres. Some refer to romances, others to fables, others to bestiaries, and the only thing that all of these images seem to have in common, not the only, there are 2 things that all these images seem to have in common, is margins of the Rutland Psalter and the exemplar collections where they appear. For instance, the stag and the snake story that seems to come from bestiary also appears at least in 3 exemplar collections. The fox and stork story that is also referring to Aesop fable appears in several exemplar collections, and I'm here citing 2 of them. And finally, The Flight of Alexander, which refers to Roman of Alexander, that tells a story about how Alexander the Great went very up in the sea on griffins, is compared in different exemplar collections with us. It is compared to the medieval audience who are encouraged by this image and by this story to look very high above heaven and be as risky as Alexander the Great and go as high above as possible and not look down. There is another group of images that doesn't seem to be pointing into direction of specific textual sources immediately, but these are the images that connect to the tradition of exemplar more directly. And one of them is this very prominent image that anyone who is dealing with medieval manuscript recognizes immediately, because you see dogs pursuing hare or hare pursuing dogs in almost every manuscript. But this is also a very prominent metaphor in contemporary preaching, because preachers would use both hare and dogs to encourage their audiences to flee temptations as quickly as hare flees the dog, or to temper your urges as the dog who listens to the master and doesn't really pursue the hare. So it was a very flexible metaphor that can change its meaning depending on the context in which the preacher can use it. And I think in a way it similarly functions in different manuscripts when it changes its context and changes its meaning. And finally, there are also scenes of everyday life, and we already partially described one of them as a chess game that refers to the story of the prodigal son or to the vice of gambling. And both of these stories, the prodigal son story and multiple stories around gambling, were traveling through one exemplar collection to the other. But there are also images of everyday lives that might not be referring to the stories, but also like dog and hare metaphor, referring to prominent metaphors that preachers would use to encourage their audiences to a certain behavior, like this acrobat. Etienne de Bourbon compares such an acrobat to a sinner who walks on their hands with their feet up, because you should not walk like this, because in this way your head goes down and is directed towards the ground, towards lower matters. And I think it is when we look at the images in the Rutland Psalter as a whole collection is when their connection to preaching becomes an interesting possibility. Because the variety of stories that we see here is exactly the variety of stories, the specific selection sometimes of stories that preachers would use to encourage their audiences to a particular line of thinking or particular behavior. But what is interesting is that between Marginalia, the rise of Marginalia and the rise of stories in contemporary preaching, there seem to be several quite significant chronological and geographical parallels. So there is a chronological parallel in the sense that both manuscripts with Marginalia and exemplar collections seem to start to appear around the same period of time. We see that the specific selection and specific variety of subjects in the margins can be attested by the specific stories that preachers would be using, and particularly the specific variety of these stories. We'll also see that preaching can provide an interesting framework for understanding how these images would function in devotional context. And there is also an important geographical parallel. And this geographical parallel was first pointed out to by Lilian Randall in her article Exemplar as Sources for Gothic Marginal Illumination, published in 1957. And this article hasn't produced as much response in the scholarship as I think it deserves. And in this publication, she points out to the fact that lists of exemplar and manuscripts with Marginalia basically appear in the same regions in England in flank of Flemish territories. And then in her biggest seminal publication, Lilian Randall reiterates the same idea, but in a slightly diluted form. But the consequent scholarship never produced a significant study on the connection between Marginalia and preaching. And on several occasions, this idea was dismissed. For instance, Michael Camille, in his study, also seminal study, Image on the Edge, he rejects the idea of the connection between Marginalia and exemplar on the basis that the simple moralizations of exemplar cannot attest to the complexity of playfulness of Marginalia. And I think it's quite the opposite. The complexity of playfulness of exemplar can attest to the complexity of playfulness of Marginalia. We should just read more exemplar. But it's not that exemplar are not used in scholarship to trace specific iconographic sources for specific subjects. They are used quite a lot, but never more than that. And I think partially it is connected to the fact that when we deal with Marginalia, we try to find specific textual sources for each image. And it's probably extremely difficult or even impossible to find specific textual sources for each exemplum that is out there and connect this specific exemplum with a specific marginal image. But I think it should not discourage us from trying to find this connection between preaching and Marginalia, and here's the reason why. We are dealing with an oral culture, and when we think about exemplar, these exemplar were aids that preachers would use to deliver sermons orally. And the main line of transmission of exemplar was through the word of mouth. And a lot of preachers would specifically indicate the sources from which they received their specific stories that they wrote down. For instance, they would say, audivi, ritulit mihi, narratut mihi, which means that they heard these stories. And another aspect of exemplar collections that points to the fact that they were very actively used orally and in oral culture is the fact that when we trace one exemplum in different exemplar collections, we see that quite often it changes its character. It changes sometimes the gender of the main protagonist could change, or the number of characters could change, or the moralization of this exemplar could change. And if we accept that Marginalia participate in the same oral culture as in the same culture of religious storytelling as exemplar, This leads to specific implications because if these stories are so flexible and changeable, we cannot really use one specific textual source for each image and just work within the limits of the iconographic method. And I'm now going to contradict what I said before, because in all of my previous talk, I was trying to find specific textual sources for a specific exemplar. But I think with Marginalia, it cannot really work like this. And in order to understand why, we need to go back to the very chess game that we saw at the beginning. It may seem that in both cases, in Chartres Cathedral and in the Rutland Psalter, both images have the same moralization because they depict the same thing. But precisely because in the Rutland Psalter, this image is abstracted from the bigger prodigal son narrative, its link to the prodigal son story is only one possibility among many. There is no way for us to say and to know for sure which kind of story medieval audiences would recognize when they saw this image. Was it a prodigal son story that they would see in a bigger prodigal son narrative? Was it a prodigal son story in which the main protagonist, the main story was recounted from the perspective of a mother? Was it one of the many gambling stories that we see in preaching that just exposes this vice of gambling that we see represented in this image? And how one specific image can change its meaning depending on the context, we can see if we look at the Book of Hours that I showed you a bit earlier. Here we see that the image of the chess game is connected with the religious depiction of Christ, and the Christ's face is bleeding. And in the text of this Book of Hours, and in the text where the image is placed, which is placed within the litany, there is no connection to the prodigal son story at all. Nothing in this depiction, nothing in the context of this manuscript points to the prodigal son story. Instead, trying to understand these correlations between the two images, we may start if we look at this depiction of crucifixion in contemporary illumination. For instance, in the Queen Mary Psalter, we see that below the bleeding image of Christ, two soldiers cast dice on his clothes. And in contemporary preaching, this connection between casting dice and gambling and crucifying Christ again and hurting him physically was extremely prominent. For instance, Thomas Contemporary tells a story, and he's very specific about that. He tells a story of two gamblers who gambled and cast dice on Good Friday in Leuven. And on their way back home, they saw they saw a man lying on the road, and this man was bleeding. And they immediately recognized that that was the body of Christ. And preachers would emphatically emphasize multiple times in their exemplar that casting dice is connected with swearing and blaspheming, and these are equal to Christ's physical abuse. And in multiplicity of these stories that reference gambling in connection to hurting Christ and causing him pain, there is no reference to the prodigal son story. And the fact that there is no reference to the prodigal son story tells us that one image can refer to multiple stories and could change its meaning. And in order to account for this flexibility of imagery, to its ability to portray multiple stories in one depiction, it may be productive to think about the connection of these images to text, not through a simple connection between one story and one image, but through the idea of storytelling context. It simply means that margins are not texts, and unlike texts, then they have the ability to tell more than one story. Marginalia are translations. They are not simple consequences of texts. They are stories, visual stories in their own right. And artists were visual storytellers and worked in a language that was drastically different from the vernacular or the Latin of preachers. And instead of thinking and instead of trying to link of one image to a specific story, it's, I think, more productively think about them as being embedded in a bigger pool of stories. And thinking about them as images which can absorb multiple stories and then have the potential to tell any of these stories. And the image storytelling input and output constitutes its storytelling context. And through this idea of storytelling context, it may be slightly easier for us to approach images such as this one. What we see here is something that no exemplar collection can describe. It portrays a siren, which is horned and is playing a bagpipe, and a man dancing cheerfully to the sounds of its music. And sirens in medieval thought were associated with devilish creatures whose music lures humans to spiritual and physical and spiritual death. But this siren, its devilish aspects are emphasized even more because we see that this siren is horned and is playing bagpipe, an instrument often associated with the devil. And indeed, I couldn't find any exemplum that can explain such an image. But if we not think about them as separate stories, but if we think about storytelling context around the theme of dancing in preaching, we might start making sense of this image. Because preachers came to almost overwhelming conclusion that dancing comes from the devil. Unlike heavenly music of a harp or an organ, dancing inverts and mocks the mass. In anonymous exemplar collection that we have at the British Library that dates from the second half of the 13th century, the devil is keen on encouraging people to dance because it mocks the liturgy, which he is very happy about. In another exemplar collection produced in the early 14th century, the devil is giving a very extensive monologue in which he says that dancing is his liturgy and musicians are his priests. And Thomas Contemporary was particularly keen on describing various horrible consequences of dancing. For instance, he tells the story of a young girl who danced the whole Sunday, and obviously this girl was possessed by the devil. And according to Thomas Contemporary, it were devils who were indulging in dancing all over medieval Europe. And he particularly tells a story about a group of devils who danced for many hours in the disguise of Cistercian monks, and then they threw themselves into the Rhine near Cologne. And as I said, none of these stories describes a particular exemplum, but what they do is they none of this image doesn't refer to any of the stories that I just outlined. But what it does is it imaginatively responds to some of the key ideas in these stories and imaginatively visualizing religious discourse on a given theme. It's an image that embodies multiple stories and produces them and shapes them, absorbs them and shapes them into something new, namely an imaginative marginal image. And to conclude, I want to say that what I just presented to you are just several ideas around the theme of preaching and the connection between marginalia and preaching. And as I pointed out at the beginning, we cannot really respond to all the questions and all puzzling aspects of marginalia just through the lenses of preaching. But preaching has wonderful potential to explain some of the most puzzling aspects of marginalia, and the more I read Exemplar, the more I think I understand at least some of the margins that we see in the Rutland Psalter. And there is not much research has been done in this regard. So I guess that is the main message of this lecture. Thank you very much.
Oh, what a wonderful set of pictures we've been looking at, and a very learned discussion about them. So thank you, and for opening that set of sources to us. Does anybody have any questions for our speaker? Yes.
I think this is very fascinating, but it probably has a longer history, and I'm thinking of something that's not a manuscript, but by a tapestry, which of course also has what are effectively marginalia, which you can see as, in least some of them quite clearly, commenting on the events that are shown. So it's a long history, but I can see that there are additional things are coming in with the mendicants who are preaching and are using this sort of thing. There is a bit of a problem because you're dealing with really deluxe manuscripts, and actually translating this to mendicants going out to the man, literally to the man in the street, and the man in the street does not have access to this sort of manuscript. So there is, I think, a bit of a tendency to look at deluxe things and to think who can actually have access to them.
Oh, thank you very much. This is a wonderful question. So mendicants, if we think about the connection between manuscripts with marginalia and mendicants, it will not be very difficult to find. On one hand, we have a selection of psalters from the mid-13th century that all have this some depiction of marginalia, and in most cases we cannot connect them to specific owners, but in cases where we do connect them to specific owners, the connection to mendicants is not very difficult to find. For instance, there is a Curden Psalter that was produced in Oxford, and it contains images of Dominicans. There is a Psalter in Liège that basically all marginalia in this Psalter are depicting either Franciscans or some stories that were connected with the realm of Franciscans. But then, if you talk about the Rutland Psalter, it's even easier, because King Henry III and Eleanor of Provence were big patrons of Dominicans and Franciscans. And Eleanor of Provence, for instance, she was in correspondence with Adam Marsh, a Franciscan, who we know came to the court regularly to preach. And both King Henry III and Eleanor of Provence gave a lot of money to both Dominicans and Franciscan orders. And we also know that this kind of religious storytelling was sort of democratic, because on one hand, that's what the beauty of these stories is, that they travel everywhere. They not only travel horizontally, they travel vertically as well through all layers of society. And on one hand, we know that mendicants would use similar stories to preach in front of the parish audience, for instance. But we also know that Dominicans, who were very close to the royalty, would use the same exact stories in deluxe manuscripts, such as, for instance, Le Somme de Roi, that was produced for King Louis IX. And this manuscript contains a lot of exemplars that are also contained in exemplar collections that were produced, we know, not for a specific high-standing noble audience. Although you're right that the stories that would travel in different exemplar collections, sometimes they would account for a specific audience to which they refer. but they also would travel across different audiences.
Go to Michael first. Michael.
I'm sorry. Well, thank you very, very much. I'm sure we all really enjoyed that. The reason being that you clarified a number of points and brought them together so brilliantly. I was just thinking, in the context of what you were saying, there's more than one way to interpret, isn't there? And everyone can visualize a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. You don't need a preacher to tell you that. So I think the first thing you've brought out is that can happen. But also, there are other ways it can happen. And in terms of the court, minstrels and other players at the court, whether they're waffle makers or people who balance dishes on their fingers, are very, very important too. And many of those stories were known to what we might call the working class, who interacted with the aristocracy, and the joke is then transmitted into the aristocratic manuscript. What do you think of that?
I think it's, well, I think maybe, I hope that I'm trying to make exactly this point, that stories, that these marginalia are embedded in storytelling more generally. I want to show the connection to preaching because I think preaching shows specifically how these images would be used in the devotional context, because there are, we see these stories in romances and other genres. We know that all kinds of people would retell these stories, but to me it seems that preaching really shows this devotional function of images and how entertaining aspects of these images can be kind of turned on their other side and put to the service of higher matters. And that is the power of this idea, I think, something that I really like about it. But I don't think that preaching can really explain marginalia because, as I said at the beginning, there are several different aspects of marginalia that also need to be taken into account. I just think that this is a stimulating idea that needs to be explored more because it shows the framework for understanding of marginalia. It doesn't only show the specific connection to particular stories that only preachers used. I guess I wanted to emphasize this specific connection to give some power to this idea, but yeah, I think ideally when I will be finishing writing about the Rutland Psalter, I will try to show that it is connected to the storytelling more generally rather than to specific preaching culture only.
Well, thank you very much. That was very clear. What I thought you brought out also was the fact that the artist is important. And this manuscript is quite early in this process, but it becomes the case that these manuscripts were known to other artists. They didn't need model books necessarily. Once they've seen something, they can reproduce it. And I think there's another story there where there is artistic agency within all this. So.
Yes, and at the moment, specifically, I'm writing a chapter on artistic agency, which is actually called Agency. And but that's probably the most difficult chapter to write.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful paper, fascinating, and very nice to see this conjunction between the exemplar and these images. I just wondered, is it the right date for it to be Richard of Cornwall when he's just become King of Germany? I mean, he's even closer to the mendicants, I think, than Henry, really. And that would be perhaps quite nice.
you made me think, some of the images made me think of Viardoncourt's,
Sorry, about what?
Viardoncourt's book,
Okay, yeah.
the
yeah.
sketchbook.
Yeah.
And I think he has an image of people playing dice in it. And then the dancing man, is that the fool as well? It looks like the sort of the madman and things. But it made me think that sometimes, like that image that we often see as pride falling off his horse, it's the same image that's sometimes used, for instance, to show, in one of the Genoese annals, it shows the death of Frederick Barbarossa, and it's sometimes used for the same image is used for other ideas. So it's almost as if you've got this sort of collection of images, which then almost as you have the collection of exemplar. Very fascinating indeed. Most of the exemplar collections you mentioned, they're Dominican really rather than Franciscan, aren't they? Stephen of Bourbon and Thomas Cantimpré, and yes. And I just wondered if there are any indications within this of whether, have you got any images of any of the mendicants, either Franciscans or Dominicans, within this manuscript, or any indication of which way the patron is interested?
No, not in this particular manuscript, but in a series of other psalters that I look at, you do see sometimes depictions of Franciscans and Dominicans. I'm not sure to what extent we can talk about very specific connection of why Marginalia in these manuscripts in the connection with Dominicans and Franciscans, but it's just still a very interesting idea. And thank you for mentioning Richard of Cornwall and him becoming the King of Germany. There is an image in the Rutland Psalter of a double-headed eagle that seemed to be mocked. He's hanging on the decorated border like a poultry. So it might be some sort of a joke in reference to that. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know if I was next, but thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elena. That was fascinating. Just very quickly, as a footnote to what Michael said, and also Lindy. This is a sort of Salome figure that's been taken out from some, and you get this occasionally. I saw in the Lilian Randall, there's a single figure of a death figure. It's taken with 3 living and 3 dead thing. They've just used this one to express the idea, as the psalm says, in the depths of the earth. So I'm sure they're doing that quite a lot, looking at other manuscripts, as Michael says, and also just sort of pulling them apart, a narrative scene, if you like, and just using motifs from it. I really wanted to ask you how hermeneutically useful it is to you to question, in the context of your project as a whole, to question why this stuff goes out and why you stop getting these marginal images, from the later 14th century onwards. You just vanish, really. And, it's true that in the borders you still have a few grotesque and things, but you don't have anything like this. It's like a cultural shift, at least in terms of manuscript production.
So the question is...
The question is it useful to you, for the big picture you're formulating, to think about how and why this stuff goes out, why it stops being popular? And I wondered if you had a theory about that, basically, or a hypothesis, really, about it.
Well, in order to try to answer this question, I need to look into completely different material that dates to much later.
That's true.
And I think that it will not necessarily be connected, the things, the reasons why something appears and the reason why something disappears. So I'm not sure to what extent.
Well, the point is that if you think about why it disappears, then it might help you to understand why it appears in the first place. You see what I mean? I don't know that it would, but it's surely something you need to consider. Are you going to get asked about it by your examiner?
It's true. Well, I will start thinking about this now.
Typically impossible questions from Professor Luxford.
Thank you very much. I was delighted to see this manuscript. Particularly, there's some very beautiful, very subtle images in it. The siren's a beautiful little creature, isn't it? My question, though, is about navigation.
Okay.
Because I often find when I'm dealing with a manuscript, I don't know where to go. If there's a big wall of text, it's quite hard to find out where am I, what am I looking at. And the advantage I've often found of marginal images is it helps you to work out where I am, where I'm going, what's been in what order. The reason I bring this up, though, because you've doubtless considered that, is it raises a question about the direction of the experience of these images. Most of your discussion has seen them either as a separate but related story or as something that is corresponding to text. But from the perspective of a reader, it might well be that the image is their first thing they notice and recognize as their kind of touchstone. And then from that get back into the text. And that might well change how they're reading and experiencing them. There's a lot of educational theory that's been done on things like priming, which is where you see something else first that primes your brain to then think about the next thing you encounter in a certain way. So I was wondering if you thought about the sort of sequence in which these things might be encountered and how that might modify your discussion of them.
Thank you. Yes, I did think about this. And from two perspectives, I guess, because you can think about this from the perspective of how it was done, how it was made, and from the other point of view is from the perspective of the audience. And from the perspective of the audience, there is, I think, already done a lot of thinking on this part, because I guess around 20 years ago, or maybe even more than that, researchers particularly started to emphasize that marginalia are not in the margin in the sense that these are the first things that you see on the page, and these are the most prominent features in books. So in this sense, they're not marginal at all, and yes, they indeed probably did help navigation in the manuscript, and they do definitely help navigating me through the manuscript. But on the other hand, there is a sequence from the perspective of how this manuscript was made, and here we're dealing with a series of artists, at least 4 artists, who were doing work on this manuscript choir by choir. And each artist contributed in different ways and in different volumes. And sometimes you see that artists, at least one of them, would connect several images in a row. And it seems that, for instance, artist A, as identified by Nadia Morgan, this artist sometimes... So the main principle of this book is the principle of variety, because margins do not repeat at all, and that was one of the challenges that artists had to meet, because they needed to depict very different scenes on every single page. And so artist A did it in a variety of ways, because his challenge was the biggest, because he illustrated most of the book. And sometimes he would depict several bears in a row, but in different scenes, maybe to ease this challenge of variety for themselves. Or you see 2 images of cats, and they are both on sequential pages, probably also because that was kind of artist A's process of depicting images. And then there are images of fights in different variations, in maybe 10 pages in a row by artist A. And again, it seems to be part of their of his or her creative process of developing the variety of images on every single page. Yeah.
I have a question. Oh, sorry. I have a question from online. They say the images shown provide a clear link or links to the biblical stories. Do the colors used in the images also have particular significance? For example, good, bad, envy, things like that.
Thank you for the question. It doesn't seem so. Again, it seems that the main principle in colors of the Rutland Psalter is the principle of variety, because artists would depict, would normally use definitely more than one color to even paint one figure, and normally they would combine contrasting colors together, and lighter with the darker and things like that. But because these colors are used consequently throughout many different scenes, I don't think that there is a particular symbolic significance to these colors, because you can only really attest to the symbolic significance of color if you see a particular scene multiple times and in different contexts, and then you can see a particular patterns of how this color appears. And here, because each scene is different from the other, and some of them are either very rare or unique in this manuscript, you can't really see any symbolic patterns in color codes. Yeah, but thank you for the question.
Okay, seems like it's time for us to get out of here. There is something I neglected earlier on, which says that our president has been a president for a year without her medal.
Thank you very much, Richard.
I was going to kneel and place it round her neck, but I realised I couldn't actually reach if I did that, so I just handed it over.
Much more importantly, let's all thank Eleanor for a really fascinating paper to launch our season. So thank you so much.